Every man deserves a chance to prove his innocence, but sometimes salvation comes from an unexpected source. In frontier towns of the 1800s, justice moved fast as a hangman's rope, and second chances were rare. A penniless cowboy stood on the gallows, falsely accused of cattle theft, with the town gathered to witness what they believed was justice. As the noose tightened around his neck and death seemed certain, his faithful donkey suddenly charged forward through the crowd. What the animal revealed would shock everyone and change everything forever. What could a simple donkey know that the town had missed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is truly a tale that will stay with you long after it ends. I guarantee you that completely. The sun hung heavy over Clearwater Valley, its golden rays painting the dusty streets of a town that had seen better days. In the distance, the mountains stood like ancient sentinels, their peaks catching the last light of afternoon. This was a place where a man's word still meant something, where neighbors helped neighbors through harsh winters and harder times, where justice was swift and mercy scarce. Jake Morrison had called this valley home for the better part of 3 decades. At 52, his face bore the weathered lines of a life lived outdoors, deep grooves around his eyes from squinting against the sun, a salt and pepper beard that he kept neatly trimmed out of respect for his late wife's memory, and hands that told the story of every fence mended, every calf birthed, every storm weathered. Jake's small homestead sat on the outskirts of town, a modest cabin with a single room that served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom all in one. The wooden structure had grown grey with age, its chinking needing repair before winter set in again. Behind the cabin stood a weathered barn that leaned slightly to the east, as if bowing to the prevailing winds that swept down from the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was his, bought with honest sweat and paid for with years of careful saving. His most treasured possession wasn't the land or the cabin, though. It was a small, dusty brown donkey named Moses. The animal had wandered onto his property 5 years ago, half-starved and bearing the scars of rough treatment. Jake had nursed the creature back to health, and Moses had repaid that kindness with unwavering loyalty. Where other men might have preferred a horse for its speed and strength, Jake found comfort in Moses's steady, patient nature. The donkey possessed an intelligence that often surprised visitors, seeming to understand not just commands but emotions, offering his presence during Jake's loneliest moments. Since Martha's passing 3 years ago, Moses had become more than a work animal. He was Jake's closest companion. The donkey would follow him around the property like a devoted dog, braying softly when Jake spent too long brooding over his wife's grave marker, which stood beneath the old oak tree behind the cabin. Martha Morrison had been the light of Jake's life, a schoolteacher who had seen something worthy in a rough cowboy and had spent 15 years smoothing his edges with her gentle wisdom. The town of Clearwater itself stretched along a single main street, flanked by false-fronted buildings that had been painted various shades of brown and grey. Henderson's General Store occupied the central position, its wide windows displaying everything from bolts of cloth to farm implements. Next door sat Murphy's Saloon, where men gathered after long days to share news, settle disputes, and forget their troubles in whiskey. The bank, a solid brick structure that spoke of permanence and trust, stood across from the church, a white wooden building with a bell tower that called the faithful to worship every Sunday morning. At the end of town sat the jail, a squat building constructed of local stone with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. Sheriff Tom Bradley had run the law in Clearwater for nearly 15 years, maintaining order through a combination of firm justice and hometown understanding. He knew every family in the valley, their histories and their troubles, and he believed in giving good people the benefit of the doubt. But Bradley also knew when to draw the line, and cattle theft was one crime that crossed every line the frontier had drawn. The economic heartbeat of the valley came from ranching, with several large spreads surrounding the town. The biggest of these belonged to William Big Bill Hartwell, whose Cross H Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime grazing land. Hartwell had arrived in the valley 20 years ago with money, ambition, and the kind of ruthless business sense that built empires. His ranch hands were well paid and fiercely loyal, and his cattle bore the reputation of being among the finest in the territory. Hartwell himself was a man who commanded respect through sheer presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair. That he wore slicked back and a mustache that gave him a distinguished air. He dressed in fine clothes, rode expensive horses, and lived in a grand house that overlooked the valley like a castle. But beneath his polished exterior lay the hard pragmatism of a man who had built everything he owned through determination. And some whispered methods that weren't always entirely ethical. Working for Hartwell was his foreman, Dutch Graves, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. Graves had drifted into the valley 2 years ago with recommendations from ranchers in Colorado and Wyoming, along with stories of his effectiveness in dealing with rustlers and troublemakers. He was lean and wiry, with pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a thin smile that never reached those eyes. The other ranch hands gave him wide berth, sensing something dangerous in his quiet competence. Jake Morrison had had few dealings with either Hartwell or Graves, preferring to keep to his small operation and avoid the politics that sometimes swirled around the bigger ranches. He owned a modest herd of 30 cattle, enough to provide a living but not enough to attract much attention. He sold his beef locally, mostly to Henderson for the store's customers, and he'd never had cause to compete with the larger operations. But times had been getting harder. The winter before had been particularly brutal, and Jake had lost 6 head to cold and predators. Spring flooding had damaged his grazing land, forcing him to purchase feed that strained his modest savings. Martha's medical bills before her passing had consumed most of what they'd managed to save over the years, and Jake now found himself living month to month, carefully counting every dollar and making difficult decisions about what repairs could wait another season. The townspeople knew Jake as an honest, hard-working man who kept to himself but could be counted on in times of need. When the widow Peterson's roof had blown off in a windstorm, Jake had spent 3 days helping to rebuild it, refusing any payment. When young Tommy Henderson had fallen through the ice on Miller's Pond, Jake had risked his own life to pull the boy to safety. These were the acts that defined a man's character in a place like Clearwater, and Jake's character stood without question among those who knew him. Inside his modest cabin, reminders of Martha filled every corner. Her Bible sat on the small table. Beside his chair, a strip of red ribbon marking her favorite passage in Psalms. Her sewing basket remained in the corner, untouched since her passing, a monument to the domestic happiness that had once filled this simple space. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace stood their wedding photograph, faded now, but still showing the joy in both their faces on that long-ago day when their future seemed bright and unlimited. Each evening, Jake would sit in his wooden chair and read aloud from Martha's Bible, his voice roughened by years of outdoor work and made hoarse with emotion. Moses would listen attentively from his position by the door, as if he understood not just the sound, but the meaning of the ritual that helped Jake through his loneliest hours. Sometimes, when the wind was right, Jake could almost hear Martha's gentle laughter echoing through the cabin, a sound that had once filled his world with warmth. The financial pressures were mounting steadily. The bank held the note on his property, and while they'd been patient so far, patience had its limits. Jake had been considering selling some of his remaining cattle to ease the burden, but that would mean less income next year, a dangerous spiral that had claimed other small ranches in the valley. He'd watched good men lose everything they'd worked for, seen families broken apart by debt and desperation. The thought of joining their ranks kept him awake many nights, staring at the ceiling and searching for solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. On this particular September evening, Jake was making his evening rounds, checking on his small herd, and ensuring all was well before darkness fell. Moses trotted beside him, occasionally investigating interesting scents or pausing to regard Jake with those intelligent dark eyes. The cattle were settling for the night, their low lowing creating a peaceful soundtrack to the approaching twilight. The routine was one Jake cherished, a time when the day's worries seemed to fade into the rhythm of simple, honest work. He checked the fence line for breaks, counted his stock, made mental notes about which animals might need attention. It was work his hands could do while his mind found the kind of peace that had been rare since Martha's death. In these quiet moments, he felt closest to the life they'd built together, the dreams they'd shared for a future that would never come. As they walked the fence line, Jake found his thoughts turning to the future with a mix of concern and determination. The debts were mounting, and he wasn't sure how he'd make it through another hard winter. But giving up wasn't in his nature. Martha had always said he was too stubborn for his own good, but she'd said it with love, recognizing that same stubborn streak that had carried him through the hardest times of his life. Moses suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he tested the evening breeze. Jake paused, trusting the donkey's superior senses. In the distance, he could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats, several riders coming fast up the road toward town. Jake shielded his eyes against the setting sun, watching as a group of horsemen thundered past his property without stopping, their faces grim and determined. Something was wrong. Riders didn't move with that kind of urgency unless there was trouble. Brewing and trouble in a small town like Clearwater had a way of touching everyone before it was through. Jake finished his evening chores with a growing sense of unease, Moses remaining unusually alert and skittish as they made their way back to the cabin. Inside, Jake lit his oil lamp and settled into his chair, Moses taking his customary position by the door, where he could watch both Jake and the outside world. The cabin felt larger and emptier than usual, filled with the absence of the woman who had once made it a true home. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and setting the barn door to creaking on its hinges. Fall was coming early this year. Jake could feel it in the changing air. As darkness settled fully over the valley, Jake prepared for bed, unaware that this would be the last night he would spend in his own cabin for a very long time. Moses settled onto his blanket near the door, but his ears remained alert, as if the donkey sensed that change was coming with the dawn. In the distance, the lights of Clearwater twinkled like earthbound stars, and the wind carried the faint sounds of activity from the town, sounds that would grow much louder and more ominous in the morning light. Dawn broke cold and grey over Clearwater Valley, the sun struggling through heavy clouds that promised rain before the day was through. Jake Morrison woke to the sound of Moses braying urgently outside the cabin, an unusual occurrence that brought him instantly alert. The donkey's calls weren't the gentle morning greeting Jake had grown accustomed to, but sharp, insistent warnings that spoke of immediate danger. Jake pulled on his clothes quickly and stepped outside to find Moses standing rigid beside the corral, his ears pinned back and his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following the animal's gaze, Jake saw a dust cloud approaching fast along the main road, too many riders moving too quickly for any ordinary business. The sound reached him before he could clearly make out the riders. The thunder of hooves, the creak of leather, the jingling of spurs and bridles. As the group drew closer, Jake counted at least a dozen men, their faces set with grim purpose. At their head rode Sheriff Bradley, his usually calm demeanor replaced by the tight-lipped expression of a man carrying out unpleasant duty. Behind, Bradley came Dutch Graves, Hartwell's foreman, his pale eyes already fixed on Jake with an intensity that made the cowboy's skin crawl. The rest of the riders were a mixture of ranch hands from the Cross H and townsmen Jake recognized, but had never expected to see riding in such a posse. The group pulled up in Jake's yard, their horses snorting and stamping, still heated from the hard ride. Sheriff Bradley dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, not drawn, but positioned where it could be reached quickly. The gesture wasn't lost on Jake, who felt the first cold touch of real fear settling in his stomach. "Morning, Jake," Bradley said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "I'm afraid I'm here on official business." "What kind of business would that be, Tom?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing alarm in his chest. Moses moved closer to his side, the donkey's presence offering comfort in the face of growing uncertainty. Dutch Graves spurred his horse forward, his thin lips curving into that humorless smile Jake had learned to distrust. "The kind of business that involves stolen cattle, Morrison. 20 head of cross-H beef that went missing 3 nights ago." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been expecting trouble of some kind, but this was worse than anything he'd imagined. Cattle theft was a hanging offense in the territory, and false accusations had a way of becoming true in the eyes of a community that valued its herds above almost everything else. "I don't know anything about any stolen cattle," Jake said firmly, meeting Bradley's eyes. "You know me, Tom. You know I wouldn't steal so much as a chicken, let alone 20 head of beef." "Maybe I thought I knew you," Bradley replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice that gave Jake a thin thread of hope. "But the evidence says otherwise. Dutch here tracked the missing cattle to a canyon about 5 miles south of here. Says he found your tracks all around where the cattle were being held." Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of the accusation. He knew the canyon Bradley was talking about, a natural holding area where rustlers had been known to keep stolen cattle before driving them out of the territory. But he hadn't been anywhere near that canyon in months, certainly not in the past week. "That's impossible," Jake said, shaking his head. "I haven't been to Willow Canyon since spring. Besides, you can check my herd. Do I look like a man who's suddenly come into 20 extra head of cattle?" Graves leaned forward in his saddle, his pale eyes glittering with something that might have been satisfaction. "Smart rustler doesn't keep stolen cattle with his own herd, Morrison. Smart rustler moves them through quick, sells them to buyers who don't ask too many questions. And I suppose you've got buyers lined up to testify to that?" Jake shot back, his temper beginning to flare despite the danger of his situation. "Don't need buyers when we've got tracks," Graves replied smoothly. "Your boot prints clear as day, your horse's hoof prints too, unless you're going to tell us someone else rides that bay mare of yours." Jake felt the ground shifting beneath. His feet, the solid foundation of his reputation, crumbling under the weight of evidence he couldn't explain. He looked around at the faces of the men surrounding him, searching for any sign of doubt or sympathy. Most avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to challenge the foreman's accusations. "I want to see these tracks myself," Jake said, grasping at the only defense he could think of. "If they're really there, I want to know how they got there." Bradley nodded slowly. "That's your right, Jake. But first, I've got to place you under arrest. You'll come with us peaceful, or we'll take you in whatever condition we have to." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of finality through Jake's world. He looked at Moses, who had moved even closer and was now pressing against Jake's leg, the donkey's warm bulk offering what comfort he could. The thought of leaving his faithful companion behind, of not knowing what would happen to the animal if Jake didn't return, was almost as frightening as the prospect of facing a hangman's rope. "What about Moses?" Jake asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Who's going to look after him if you take me in?" "Animal will be fine," Bradley said, though his tone suggested he hadn't really considered the question. "Somebody in town will take him in." Jake knew better than that. Moses was old for a donkey, not much use for heavy work, and his loyalty to Jake made him difficult for others to handle. More likely, the animal would be turned out to fend for himself, or, if winter came early, put down as a kindness. The thought hit Jake harder than the accusations themselves. As if sensing Jake's distress, Moses brayed softly and nuzzled his shoulder. The simple gesture of affection, offered at such a dark moment, nearly broke Jake's composure entirely. He reached up to stroke the donkey's neck, feeling the coarse hair and warm skin that had become as familiar as his own. "I need a few minutes to put things in order," Jake said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "If you're taking me in, there are things that need doing." Bradley considered this, then nodded. "5 minutes, Jake. But don't try anything foolish. You're outnumbered, and running will only make things worse." Jake moved through his morning routine like a man in a dream, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind struggled to process what was happening to him. He fed Moses, made sure the donkey had access to water, and secured the cabin as best he could. Each action felt weighted with finality, as if he were closing a chapter of his life that might never be reopened. From Martha's Bible, he took the red ribbon bookmark and slipped it into his shirt pocket, a small comfort to carry with him into the unknown. The gesture was simple, but felt necessary, like taking a piece of Martha's faith and love into whatever darkness lay ahead. When his time was up, Jake allowed Bradley to place the shackles on his wrists, the iron bands cold and heavy against his skin. The metal felt like a betrayal, transforming him from a respected member of the community into a common criminal with the simple click of a lock. As they prepared to leave, Moses followed them to the edge of the property, his plaintive calls growing more urgent as the distance between him and Jake increased. The sound of the donkey's distress followed them all the way to town, a mournful soundtrack to Jake's journey from freedom to captivity. With each step, Jake's world grew smaller and darker, the mountains that had always represented permanence and strength now seeming to close in around him like prison walls. By the time they reached Clearwater, word had already spread through the community. People lined the main street, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, disappointment, and anger. These were people Jake had known for years, neighbors he'd helped through hard times, yet now they looked at him with the eyes of strangers viewing a common criminal. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway of the general store, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. Jake had pulled her son from the icy pond just 2 winters ago, but now her eyes held only confusion and hurt. Old Pete Murphy emerged from his saloon, shaking his head in disgust, as if Jake's arrest had somehow betrayed the trust of every honest man in the valley. The jail cell was small and dim, its iron bars casting shadows that seemed to reach for Jake as Bradley locked him inside. Through the single small window, he could see a slice of the main street and the people going about their daily business, life continuing as if his world hadn't just ended. "I'll bring you some food later," Bradley said quietly, his discomfort evident in his refusal to meet Jake's eyes. "And if you want to send word to anyone, let me know." But Jake had no one to send word to. Martha was gone, and her sister Sarah lived too far away to help even if she could. His few friends in town would likely turn their backs on him now, and the acquaintances he'd made over the years weren't the kind who would stand by a man accused of cattle theft. As afternoon faded into evening, Jake sat on the narrow cot and tried to make sense of what had happened to him. The evidence against him seemed impossible to refute. His own tracks at the scene of the crime, his desperate financial situation providing motive, his isolation making him a perfect suspect. Yet he knew with absolute certainty that he had never stolen those cattle or any others. Somewhere out there, Moses was alone and confused, waiting for his friend to return home. Somewhere else, the real cattle thieves were probably laughing at how perfectly their plan had worked. And here in this cell, an innocent man was preparing to face the kind of frontier justice that rarely bothered with appeals or second chances. The first night in jail stretched endlessly for Jake Morrison, every sound from the street outside a reminder of the freedom he'd lost. The cell was barely 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, containing only a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a wash basin, and a bucket for necessities. Moonlight filtering through the barred window created a crosshatch pattern on the stone floor, and Jake found himself staring at those bars of shadow, wondering if they were a preview of the noose that awaited him. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the echo of Moses's distressed braying that seemed to linger in his memory. Each time Jake dozed, he dreamed of his donkey waiting faithfully by the cabin door, growing more confused and anxious with each passing hour. The thought of Moses's loyalty being rewarded with abandonment gnawed at Jake's conscience almost as much as his fear of the gallows. Dawn brought new troubles. Through his window, Jake could see people gathering in the street, their voices growing louder and more agitated as the morning progressed. Word of the cattle theft had spread beyond Clearwater, and ranchers from across the valley were riding in to hear the details. In a community where livestock represented the difference between prosperity and starvation, cattle theft struck at the very heart of their survival. Sheriff Bradley had been decent enough, allowing Jake a hot meal from Murphy's Saloon and providing him with a blanket against the night chill. But there was a distance in the lawman's manner now, a professional detachment that spoke of a man trying to reconcile his personal knowledge of Jake's character with the evidence that had been laid before him. "I've got to ask you straight out. Jake," Bradley had said during the evening questioning, "is there any reason someone would want to frame you for this? Any enemies you might have made? Any debts or disputes that could have turned ugly?" Jake had searched his memory thoroughly, but came up empty. He'd lived quietly since Martha's death, kept to himself, avoided the kinds of conflicts that bred lasting resentment. His only significant debt was to the bank, and while that was substantial, it hardly seemed the kind of thing that would drive someone to frame him for cattle theft. "There's nothing, Tom," Jake had answered honestly. "I can't think of a soul who'd have reason to do this to me." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt the nagging sensation that he was missing something important, some connection that would make sense of his predicament. The feeling persisted through the long, sleepless night, a persistent itch in his mind that he couldn't quite scratch. By mid-morning, the crowd outside had grown to nearly 50 people. Jake could hear fragments of their conversations. Angry, demands for justice, speculation about his guilt, and increasingly frequent mentions of the kind of summary justice that frontier towns sometimes dispensed when their patience ran thin. The sound of their voices created a low, continuous murmur that filled his cell like the buzzing of angry wasps. Dutch Graves appeared early, leading a group of cross-H hands to the front of the jail. The foreman's pale eyes sought Jake through the window, and when their gazes met, Graves offered that thin, humorless smile that had become familiar. There was something calculating in that expression, something that suggested Graves was seeing exactly the results he'd hoped for. The door to the jail opened, and Jake was surprised to see Reverend Samuel Hayes enter, his weathered face creased with concern. Hayes had been Clearwater's minister for nearly a decade, a soft-spoken man who'd presided over Martha's funeral and had tried several times since to draw Jake back into the church community. "Sheriff Bradley said I could speak with you," Hayes said, settling onto a wooden chair that Bradley provided. "I wanted to offer you whatever comfort I could in these dark times." "I appreciate that, Reverend," Jake replied, though he wasn't sure what comfort religion could provide against a hangman's noose. "Though I'm not sure what good prayers will do against false testimony." Hayes studied Jake's face carefully, his gray eyes reflecting years of experience in reading the hearts of troubled men. "You maintain your innocence, then?" "With every breath in my body," Jake said firmly. "I never stole those cattle, and I have no idea how my tracks got to that canyon. Someone's gone to considerable trouble to make me look guilty." The minister nodded slowly. "I've known you for years, Jacob Morrison. You're not a perfect man. None of us are. But you're not a thief. Martha used to speak of your character with such pride, your stubborn insistence on doing right, even when it cost you dearly." The simple declaration of faith in his character nearly overwhelmed Jake. In the face of mounting evidence and growing hostility from the community, having one person express belief in his innocence felt like finding water in the desert. He touched the red ribbon in his shirt pocket, Martha's bookmark, and felt a small measure of comfort from its presence. "I don't know, Reverend. The evidence against me seems pretty convincing to everyone else." "Evidence can be manufactured," Hayes said quietly, leaning closer to the bars. Tracks can be faked, testimony can be bought. What matters is the truth, and God sees the truth even when men are blinded by circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Jake could see Big Bill Hartwell arriving, his imposing presence immediately commanding attention from the gathered crowd. The rancher sat his horse like a man accustomed to authority, his silver hair gleaming in the morning. "Son," his face set in the hard lines of righteous anger. "People of Clearwater," Hartwell's voice carried easily over the crowd, practiced and commanding. "We gather here today, not just because of the theft of my cattle, but because of an assault on the very foundations of our community. When a man steals another's livestock, he strikes at the heart of our way of life." The crowd murmured agreement, their anger focusing and intensifying under Hartwell's leadership. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in his cell. The rancher was not just reporting a crime, he was inciting the community to action, shaping their emotions to serve his purpose. "I've worked 20 years to build what I have in this valley," Hartwell continued, his voice carrying the passion of a man defending his life's work. "Every head of cattle represents sweat and sacrifice, risk and reward. When someone steals from me, they steal from every honest rancher who's tried to build something lasting in this harsh land." "What about a trial?" someone called from a crowd, though the voice sounded uncertain. "Of course there'll be a trial," Hartwell replied smoothly, his tone suggesting the matter was already settled. "Judge Whitman is riding in from the county seat as we speak, but let's not pretend we don't know what the verdict will be. The evidence speaks for itself, and this community will not tolerate cattle theft, no matter who the thief might be." Jake sank onto his cot, the weight of Hartwell's words settling over him like a burial shroud. The rancher had effectively declared him guilty and suggested that the trial would be little more than a formality. In a community where Hartwell wielded enormous influence, such a declaration carried the weight of a judicial sentence. Reverend Hayes reached through the bars and placed a comforting hand on Jake's shoulder. "Don't lose hope, Jacob. Truth has a way of surfacing, even in the darkest circumstances. I've seen men walk free from situations that seemed hopeless, and I've seen the guilty exposed when they thought themselves secure in their deceptions. But what if the truth doesn't surface in time?" Jake asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in his chest since his arrest. "What if an innocent man hangs because the real criminal was clever enough to hide his tracks? Then we trust that God will see justice done, even if we cannot," Hayes replied, "but I don't believe it will come to that. There are people in this town who know your character, who won't be swayed by convenient evidence and inflammatory speeches. The truth has allies, Jacob, even when they're not immediately visible." After the minister left, Jake found himself alone, with his thoughts once again. The crowd outside had grown larger and more restless, their conversations punctuated by occasional shouts and angry exclamations. Through his small window, he could see men gesturing toward the jail, their faces flushed with righteous indignation. The irony wasn't lost on him, that these same people had known him for years, had accepted his help in times of need, had considered him a solid member of the community. But the power of accusation had transformed their perception of him overnight, turning a trusted neighbor into a despised criminal. It was a lesson in how quickly a man's reputation could crumble, how the solid ground of community acceptance could shift without warning. As afternoon wore on, Judge Whitman arrived in town. Jake caught a glimpse of the stern-faced man through his window, noting the way people stepped aside to let him pass, the respectful nods and careful greetings that marked his passage. Judge Whitman had a reputation for harsh sentences and quick justice, exactly the kind of man a community would want when dealing with cattle thieves. The judge's presence seemed to galvanize the crowd, lending an air of official gravity to the proceedings. Jake could hear his name being mentioned more frequently, always in tones of disgust and condemnation. The transformation was complete. Jake Morrison, the helpful neighbor, had become Jake Morrison, the cattle thief, and the community was ready to see justice served upon him. The second day of Jake's imprisonment began with the formal reading of charges. Judge Whitman had established himself in the hotel's largest room, transforming it into a temporary courtroom complete with borrowed furniture and official documents. Sheriff Bradley escorted Jake from his cell to face the judge. The walk through town providing another gauntlet of hostile stares and muttered accusations. Judge Whitman was an imposing figure, even seated behind a makeshift desk, his black coat giving him an almost biblical authority. His grey hair was combed severely back from a face that seemed carved from granite, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had seen every form of human weakness and found them all wanting. "Jacob Morrison," the judge intoned, in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, "you stand accused of grand theft, specifically the theft of 20 head of cattle belonging to William Hartwell of the Cross H Ranch, valued at approximately $1,000. This is a capital offense under territorial law. Do you understand the charges against you?" "I understand them, Your Honor," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But I maintain my complete innocence." Judge Whitman made a note on the papers before him, his pen scratching against the silence. "A plea of not guilty is entered into the record. Trial is set for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock in the church, it being the only building large enough to accommodate the expected attendance." The brevity of the proceedings struck Jake like a physical blow. Less than 24 hours to prepare. A defense against charges that could cost him his life. He wanted to protest the rushed timeline, but the judge's manner made it clear that objections would not be welcome. Back in his cell, Jake found himself pacing the small space like a caged animal. The walls seemed to be closing in on him with each passing hour, and the weight of his situation was becoming almost unbearable. Through his window, he could see the steady stream of people arriving in town, drawn by news of the upcoming trial like vultures to carrion. His respite came in the form of an unexpected visitor. Dr. Margaret Whitfield arrived at the jail carrying her medical bag, her practical manner cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes that missed little. "Sheriff Bradley asked me to examine you," she explained as Bradley unlocked the cell. "He wants to make sure you're fit to stand trial." The examination was routine, but Dr. Whitfield's demeanor was not. She worked with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to solving puzzles, her questions probing not just Jake's physical condition, but his mental state as well. Her hands were gentle but thorough as she checked his pulse, examined his eyes, and tested his reflexes. "You seem remarkably calm for a man facing a hanging," she observed, pressing her fingers against his wrist to check his heartbeat. "I'm innocent, doctor. That gives a man a certain peace, even in dark circumstances." She studied his face carefully, her expression unreadable. "I've seen guilty men maintain their innocence right up to the gallows. I've also seen innocent men confess to crimes they didn't commit under pressure. What makes you so certain you'll be believed?" Jake considered her question carefully. "I'm not certain of anything anymore, but I won't lie, even to save my neck. I didn't steal those cattle, and I have to believe that somehow the truth will come out." Dr. Whitfield continued her examination in silence, but Jake caught her glancing at him several times with an expression that suggested she was thinking about something beyond his medical condition. When she tested his range of motion, she paid particular attention to his back, noting the way he favored his left side and the slight wince that crossed his face when he bent forward. "This old injury," she said, pressing gently along his spine. "How long have you had trouble with it?" "About 10 years now," Jake admitted. "Took a bad fall from my horse during a roundup. It's gotten worse over the years, especially in cold weather." She nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a small leather journal. "The kind of physical labor involved in rustling cattle, driving 20 head through rough terrain, managing them alone, that would cause you considerable pain, wouldn't it?" "I suppose it would," Jake agreed, not sure where her line of questioning was leading. "Yet you..." Show no signs of recent strain or overexertion, she mused, more to herself than to him. No pulled muscles, no inflammation, no indication that you've engaged in unusually strenuous activity in the past week. As she packed her instruments, she spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. There are things about this case that don't sit right with me, Mr. Morrison. Evidence that seems almost too convenient, testimony that feels rehearsed. If you're truly innocent, you may have more allies than you realize. Before Jake could respond, she was gone, leaving him with a faint spark of hope that someone else was beginning to question the official version of events. Her medical observations might not prove his innocence, but they raised important questions about the physical possibility of his alleged crimes. Evening brought another visitor, one who surprised Jake considerably. Martha's younger sister, Sarah Coleman, had ridden in from her homestead 20 miles south of town. Sarah was a sturdy woman in her 30s, widowed like Jake, but with 3 children to raise on her own. She and Martha had been close, and she'd been one of the few people who'd made an effort to check on Jake after the funeral. "I heard what happened," she said simply, settling into the chair that had been placed outside his cell. "I don't believe a word of it." "Evidence seems to suggest otherwise," Jake replied, though her faith in him was more comforting than he wanted to admit. "Evidence can be wrong," Sarah said firmly. "Martha used to tell me stories about you, Jake, about your character, your integrity. She said you were the most honest man she'd ever known, sometimes to your own detriment. That woman knew people, and she knew you better than anyone. I trust her judgment more than I trust some convenient tracks in the dirt." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice to avoid being overheard by the deputy stationed outside the jail. "I've been asking questions, Jake. Quietly, carefully, but asking nonetheless. There are things about this whole situation that don't add up." "What kind of things?" "Well, for instance, when exactly were those cattle stolen? Dutch Graves says it was 3 nights ago, but old Pete Henderson was out hunting that same night, checking his trap lines along Miller's Creek. He says he saw the Cross-H herd in their usual pasture as late as midnight. If the cattle were stolen earlier that evening, how could Pete have seen them where they were supposed to be?" Jake felt a stirring of interest. If Sarah was right, there might be inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline that could cast doubt on the entire case. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident as she laid out her observations. "I rode past that canyon where they supposedly found your tracks. Willow Canyon, right? The ground there is mostly hard-packed stone, not the kind of surface that holds clear boot prints unless the conditions are just perfect. But we haven't had rain in 2 weeks, and the wind's been constant. How are those tracks still so clear and identifiable after 3 days?" These were good questions, Jake realized, the kind of details that a careful investigation might uncover. But would anyone be interested in conducting such an investigation? Or had the community already made up its mind about his guilt? "I also noticed something else," Sarah said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. "The path from your place to Willow Canyon crosses 3 different creek beds. After driving cattle through there, your boots would be muddy, probably caked with creek-bottom sand and debris. But the tracks Graves claims to have found were clean impressions, like they were made by boots that hadn't walked through any water." "You think someone faked the tracks?" "I think someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure you'd take the blame for this," Sarah replied grimly. "The question is who and why you specifically." As if reading his thoughts, Sarah reached through the bars and grasped his hand. "Don't give up, Jake. Martha wouldn't want you to give up, and neither do I. There are people in this valley who still believe in justice, even if they're not the loudest voices right now." Her visit left Jake with mixed feelings. The inconsistencies she'd identified were encouraging, but they also highlighted how carefully his frame-up had been orchestrated. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure he would take the blame for their crimes, and that level of planning suggested a cunning adversary who had thought through every angle. After Sarah left, Jake lay on his cot and stared at the sealing, his mind working through the information she'd provided. The timeline problems, the unlikely preservation of tracks, the clean impressions that didn't match the terrain. All small details individually, but collectively they painted a picture of manufactured evidence. The question that haunted him was why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to frame him specifically. He was nobody special, just a small rancher struggling to make ends meet. What could he possibly represent that would make him worth such effort to destroy? Outside, the voices of the crowd had grown more subdued, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Jake could hear the low murmur of ongoing conversations, the occasional laugh, the sound of horses being moved and tended. It seemed that much of the valley's population had decided to camp in Clearwater until justice was served, one way or another. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that rattled the windows of the jail and carried the scent of distant snow from the high peaks. Jake woke to the sound of hammering as carpenters erected a makeshift gallows in the town square, the rhythmic pounding serving as a grim reminder of what awaited him if the trial went badly. By 7 o'clock, people were already gathering outside the church, claiming the best positions to witness what many clearly expected to be swift justice. Ranchers had ridden in from across the territory, their faces hard with the righteous anger of men defending their livelihood. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Sheriff Bradley brought Jake breakfast, eggs, bacon, and coffee that had grown cold during the walk from Murphy's saloon. But Jake found he had little appetite. His stomach was knotted with anxiety, not just about the trial itself, but about the hostile crowd that would be judging him. These people had already made up their minds about his guilt. The trial would be little more than a formality. Before the hanging. "Time to go, Jake," Bradley said quietly, producing the shackles that had become a symbol of Jake's fallen status. The iron bands felt heavier this morning, weighted with the significance of the day ahead. The walk to the church was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The main street was lined with people, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, anger, and bloodlust. Some called out accusations as he passed, while others simply stared with the cold assessment of people watching a condemned man's final moments of life. The sound of his shackles seemed unnaturally loud against the wooden walkway, each step echoing like a funeral drum. The church itself had been transformed into a courtroom, with Judge Whitman's bench positioned where the altar usually stood. The pews were packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding into every available space. The sacred space that had once offered Jake comfort during Martha's funeral now felt like a trap closing around him. Judge Whitman commanded the room's attention simply by his presence. His black robes gave him an almost biblical authority, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily throughout the packed building. "This court is now in session. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Jacob Morrison in the matter of cattle theft. Let all who have business before this court speak truthfully, for perjury will be punished to the full extent of the law." Jake's court-appointed attorney, David Pierce, was a young man who had arrived from the county seat with Judge Whitman. Pierce was inexperienced but earnest, and Jake could see the nervousness in his hands as he arranged his few papers on the small table that served as defense counsel's desk. The lawyer had spent less than an hour with Jake the previous evening, barely enough time to understand the basic facts of the case. "The prosecution may proceed," Judge Whitman announced, his pale eyes surveying the packed courtroom with the authority of a man accustomed to having his every word obeyed. Dutch Graves stepped forward with the confidence of a man certain of his ground. He had dressed for the occasion in his best clothes, a black suit that made his pale eyes seem even more colorless, his thin hair slicked down with pomade. When he placed his hand on the Bible to be sworn in, his movements were precise and deliberate, like a man performing a ritual he had rehearsed many times. "State your name and occupation for the record," the prosecutor requested. "Dutch Graves, foreman of the Cross H Ranch, employed by William Hartwell for the past 2 years." Mr. Graves, please tell the court what happened on the morning of September 15th. Graves spoke clearly and precisely, his testimony delivered with the mechanical perfection of a well-rehearsed performance. He described discovering the missing cattle during the morning count, organizing an immediate search party, and tracking the stolen herd to Willow Canyon. His voice never wavered, his manner never showed uncertainty. At the canyon, we found clear evidence of the theft, Graves continued, his pale eyes fixed on some point above the crowd's heads. Boot prints in the soft earth near the canyon entrance, hoof prints from a horse with a distinctive chipped shoe. The tracks led directly to where the cattle had been held. Were you able to identify these tracks, Mr. Graves? Yes, sir. They belonged to Jacob Morrison. His boots have a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel, and his bay mare has a chip in the left front shoe that leaves a unique mark. I've seen both many times around town. The testimony was devastating, delivered with such confidence that Jake could see its effect on the faces in the crowd. People who had known him for years were beginning to look at him with the eyes of strangers, their faith in his character shaken by the apparent weight of physical evidence. The tracks were 3 days old when we found them, Graves continued. But the weather had been calm, no wind to speak of, no rain. Tracks can last a week or more under those conditions, especially in the kind of sheltered area where we found them. Pierce rose for cross-examination, his youth and inexperience evident in the way his voice cracked slightly when he began to speak. Mr. Graves, you say these tracks were clearly identifiable after 3 days. In your experience, how well do tracks preserve in that kind of terrain over that period of time? Depends on the weather, Graves replied smoothly, his confidence unwavering. Like I said, we've had calm conditions. No reason those tracks wouldn't be clear as the day they were made. Pierce pressed on, though Jake could see the young lawyer was struggling against Graves's experience and composure. Isn't it possible that someone else could have made similar tracks? Perhaps someone wearing boots of the same size, riding a horse with similar shoes. Graves shook his head with the patience of a man explaining something obvious to a child. Possible, but not likely. Morrison's boots and horse have distinctive characteristics that aren't common. The wear pattern on his boot heel comes from the way he favors his left side when he walks. Old injury, I'm told. The chip in his horse's shoe is in exactly the right place and the right size. Those aren't coincidences you see every day. The cross-examination continued for another few minutes, but Pierce was unable to shake Graves' testimony significantly. The foreman stepped down with the same confidence he'd displayed throughout, and Jake could feel the weight of the courtroom's opinion settling against him. William Hartwell was called next, his imposing presence immediately commanding attention from the packed church. When he placed his hand on the Bible, it was with the gravity of a man who understood the full weight of his oath. His silver hair gleamed in the morning light streaming through the windows, and his deep voice carried easily throughout the building. Mr. Hartwell, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. I knew Morrison by reputation, Hartwell replied, his tone measured and careful. Small rancher, kept to himself mostly. Never had any direct dealings with him, but I knew he was struggling financially. Word gets around in a community like this. And what was stolen from you? 20 head of prime beef cattle, worth nearly $1,000 at current market prices. But the financial loss is only part of the damage, Hartwell continued, his voice taking on the passion of a man defending his life's work. Cattle theft strikes at the very heart of our way of life, threatens the security every rancher depends on to survive in this harsh country. Hartwell's testimony painted a picture of Jake as a desperate man, driven to crime by financial pressure. He spoke of the impact cattle theft had on the entire ranching community, the way it undermined the trust and cooperation that made frontier life possible. His words were eloquent and persuasive, delivered with the authority of a man whose success spoke to his credibility. Pierce's cross-examination of Hartwell was even less effective than his questioning of Graves. The rancher was too experienced, too sure of himself to be shaken by a young lawyer's tentative probing. When Hartwell stepped down, Jake's situation looked even more desperate. The morning testimony had built a compelling case against Jake, one that seemed to answer every question and address every doubt. The physical evidence was clear, the motive was obvious, and the witnesses were credible. As the court recessed for lunch, Jake could see in the faces around him that most people had already decided his fate. Sitting in his cell during the break, Jake felt the full weight of his situation settling over him like a burial shroud. The evidence against him was overwhelming, presented by confident witnesses who seemed to have an answer for every question. Unless something dramatic happened in the afternoon session, he would be facing the hangman's noose before sunset. Through his small window, he could see the crowd gathering again, their conversations animated by the morning's testimony. The general consensus seemed to be that justice was finally being served, that the cattle thief would soon receive his due punishment. Only a few voices expressed any doubt, and they were quickly shouted down by the majority who had heard all the evidence they needed to reach their verdict. The afternoon session began with an unexpected development. Dr. Margaret Whitfield approached the bench and requested permission to speak, her professional demeanor commanding immediate attention from Judge Whitman. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity. Medical testimony was unusual in a cattle theft case, and her presence suggested complications that hadn't been considered. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and professional, "I examined Mr. Morrison yesterday at Sheriff Bradley's request. During that examination, I discovered several things that may be relevant to this case." Judge Whitman frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the deviation from standard legal procedure. "Doctor, this is in court of law, not a medical consultation. What relevance could your examination have to the charges against the defendant?" "I believe it speaks directly to his physical capability to have committed the crime, as described," she replied calmly. "Mr. Morrison is suffering from a chronic condition in his lower back, likely the result of years of physical labor and an old injury. This condition would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for him to handle cattle in the manner described by the prosecution." Jake felt a stir of hope. Dr. Whitfield had indeed noticed him favoring his back during her examination, the result of an old injury that had been bothering him increasingly in recent months. He hadn't mentioned it because he hadn't thought it was relevant, but now he realized it might be crucial to his defense. Pierce seized on this unexpected development, requesting permission to question Dr. Whitfield more thoroughly. She explained that Jake's condition would have made it virtually impossible for him to work cattle alone, particularly in the difficult terrain around Willow Canyon. The physical demands of rustling 20 head of cattle, driving them through rough country, managing them without help in unfamiliar territory, would have caused Mr. Morrison considerable pain and would likely have left him incapacitated for days afterward, she testified, her medical authority lending weight to her words. "Yet when I examined him, he showed no signs of such recent strain, no pulled muscles, no inflammation, no indication that he had engaged in unusually strenuous activity." The prosecutor objected that Dr. Whitfield's testimony was speculative, but Judge Whitman allowed it to stand, noting that expert medical opinion was relevant to the question of physical capability. Jake could see doubt beginning to creep into some faces in the courtroom, the first crack in the prosecution's seemingly solid case. Dutch Graves was recalled to address this testimony, but for the first time, his confidence seemed slightly shaken. Under Pierce's questioning, he admitted that rustling the cattle would have required significant physical effort, but maintained that Jake could have had help, despite no evidence of additional tracks at the scene. "You found only Mr. Morrison's tracks at the canyon," Pierce pressed. "If he had help, where are the tracks of his accomplices?" Graves's pale eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. "Could have been careful about where they stepped, could have stayed mounted while Morrison did the groundwork. But you testified that the stolen cattle had to be managed on foot in the canyon, that the terrain was too rough for mounted work. How do you reconcile that with your theory of accomplices? For the first time, Graves hesitated before answering. Maybe they helped earlier, during the initial theft. Maybe Morrison handled the canyon work alone. The inconsistency was small. But Pierce had succeeded in showing that Graves's story wasn't as airtight as it had initially appeared. Jake felt another flicker of hope as he saw some people in the courtroom exchanging uncertain glances. As the afternoon progressed, other small inconsistencies began to emerge. Pete Henderson, the old hunter Sarah Coleman had mentioned, took the stand with the reluctant air of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Henderson was well into his 60s, with the weathered face and steady eyes of someone who had spent his life reading sign in the wilderness. "Pete," Pierce began gently, recognizing that the old man was uncomfortable with the formal courtroom setting. "You were out checking your trap lines 3 nights ago, weren't you?" "Yes, sir. Up along Miller's Creek, same as I do every few days." "And during that trip, did you see any of Mr. Hartwell's cattle?" Henderson nodded slowly. "Saw the Cross H herd in their regular pasture, down in the bottomland near the creek. Had to be close to midnight when I passed through there." Pierce leaned forward, sensing the importance of this testimony. "You're certain it was the Cross H? In cattle, you could see the brands clearly. Been looking at cattle for 40 years, son. Know the Cross H brand well enough. Those were Hartwell's cattle, right where they were supposed to be." This testimony created a significant problem for the prosecution's timeline. If the cattle were still in their regular pasture at midnight, they couldn't have been stolen earlier that evening, as Graves had claimed. The prosecutor tried to shake Henderson's testimony, suggesting that the old man might have been mistaken about the time or the cattle, but Henderson was adamant about what he had seen. Sarah Coleman took the stand next, her practical frontier manner lending credibility to her observations. She described her visit to Willow Canyon and her doubts about the preservation and clarity of the tracks allegedly found there. "I've lived in this country all my life," she testified, her voice steady and confident. "I know how tracks weather, how wind and time affect sign on different kinds of ground. The terrain around that canyon is mostly hardpack and stone, not the kind of surface that holds clear impressions for days." She went on to describe the path from Jake's homestead to the canyon, noting the creek crossings that would have left mud and debris on anyone's boots. If someone had driven cattle through that route, their boots would show signs of it: mud, creek sand, the kind of debris you pick up walking through water. But the tracks Mr. Graves described were clean impressions, like they were made by boots that had never stepped in anything but dry dirt. Her testimony was that of a practical frontier woman who understood tracking and terrain, and her questions carried weight with people who knew her reputation for honesty and common sense. Jake could see more doubt beginning to appear in the faces of the jurors and spectators. The most emotional moment came when Reverend Hayes took the stand to speak about Jake's character. The minister's testimony was eloquent and heartfelt, describing years of quiet service to the community, acts of kindness that had gone unrecognized, and a devotion to his late wife that spoke to the depth of his moral character. "I have known Jacob Morrison for over a decade," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of his calling and the weight of genuine conviction. "I have seen him in moments of joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship. I baptized his wife Martha. I married them in this very church, and I buried her when the Lord called her home. In all that time, I have never known him to be anything but honest, hard-working, and devoted to his community." The minister paused, his gray eyes sweeping the packed courtroom. "The man I know would starve before he would steal another's property. He would work his fingers to the bone, sacrifice everything he owned before he would take what didn't belong to him. That's not just my opinion. That's what I've observed in his actions over the years." Hayes went on to describe specific instances of Jake's character, The times he had helped neighbors without payment, his devotion to Martha during her illness, his quiet generosity to families in need. The testimony painted a picture of a man whose entire life contradicted the charges against him. But even as these witnesses testified on Jake's behalf, he could see that the damage from the morning session was severe. The physical evidence was still compelling, and doubt, however reasonable, might not be enough to overcome the community's desire for swift justice. The prosecution had built a strong case, and the defense was offering only alternative explanations and character references. As the afternoon wore on, Jake noticed movement outside the church windows. Through the wavy glass, he could see a small brown figure moving among the horses and wagons in the street. His heart leaped as he realized it was Moses, somehow having traveled the 5 miles from the homestead to town. The donkey was moving through the crowd, braying occasionally, clearly searching for something or someone. The sight of his faithful companion gave Jake a surge of hope he couldn't explain rationally. Moses had somehow known to come looking for him, had made the journey to town on his own. If the donkey had that kind of intelligence and loyalty, perhaps there was still reason to believe that truth might triumph over carefully manufactured deception. Judge Whitman listened to all the afternoon testimony with the same impassive expression he had maintained throughout the day. When the last witness had spoken, he called for a brief recess before closing arguments, his manner suggesting that he had heard enough to reach his decision. During the break, Jake found himself surrounded by a small group of supporters. Sarah, Coleman, Reverend Hayes, Dr. Whitfield, and a few others who had known him long enough to doubt the charges against him. Their presence was comforting, but Jake could see in their faces the same uncertainty he felt himself. The evidence against him was still strong, and doubt, however reasonable, might not be enough to save him from the hangman's rope. Judge Whitman had just lifted his gavel to begin what everyone expected would be his final deliberation when the church doors burst open with a resounding crash that echoed through the packed building like a gunshot. The entire congregation turned as one to see Moses, Jake's loyal donkey, trotting determinedly down the center aisle, his hooves clicking against the wooden floor with each purposeful step. "What in blazes?" Judge Whitman began, his composed judicial manner shattered by the unprecedented interruption. The packed courtroom buzzed with confusion and surprise as the small brown animal made his way toward the front of the church. Moses paid no attention to the crowd or their voices. His dark eyes were fixed on Jake with single-minded intensity, and he brayed urgently. Not the gentle greeting Jake was accustomed to, but sharp, insistent calls that seemed to demand attention from every person in the building. "Someone get that animal out of here," Judge Whitman ordered, his stern composure clearly rattled by the disruption. "This is a court of law, not a barnyard." Sheriff Bradley moved to intercept the animal, but Moses dodged past him with surprising agility for a creature his age. The donkey pushed through the crowd of spectators, ignoring their attempts to catch him, his focus entirely on reaching Jake's side. When he finally arrived, Moses pressed his head against Jake's shackled hands, braying softly now, as if trying to communicate something crucial. But then Moses did something that stunned everyone present. He suddenly wheeled around and trotted back toward the doors, stopping halfway down the aisle. He turned back toward Jake and brayed again, then moved a few more steps toward the exit. The pattern repeated, a few steps, a turn back toward Jake, another urgent call. "He wants us to follow him," Sarah Coleman said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence that had fallen over the courtroom. "That animal is trying to tell us something." "This is absurd," Dutch Graves interjected, his pale eyes fixed on Moses with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. There was something in the foreman's voice, a tension that hadn't been there before, as if Moses's presence had introduced an element he hadn't anticipated. "We're not going to interrupt a trial because a donkey is causing a disturbance." But Dr. Whitfield had risen from her seat, her medical training and natural curiosity overriding the courtroom's formal atmosphere. "Animals often display remarkable, Intelligence in crisis situations, she said to Judge Whitman, her professional authority lending weight to her words. They can sense things humans miss, remember details we overlook. Perhaps we should see what he's trying to show us. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, curiosity beginning to override the formal legal procedure. Several people had begun to stand, their attention now focused more on Moses than on the proceedings that had held them spellbound all day. Judge Whitman looked as if he'd swallowed something particularly distasteful, his pale eyes moving between Moses, the restless crowd, and the unprecedented situation unfolding in his courtroom. "This is highly irregular," he said finally, his voice carrying both authority and uncertainty. "But in the interest of thorough investigation, I'll allow a brief recess. Sheriff Bradley, you and 2 deputies will accompany the defendant and this animal to see what this is about. But I warn you, this better lead somewhere substantial, or we'll return immediately and conclude these proceedings." The procession that emerged from the church was unlike anything Clearwater had ever seen. Jake, still shackled, walked beside Sheriff Bradley while Moses trotted ahead with renewed energy, occasionally looking back to ensure they were following. Behind them came Judge Whitman, his black robes already beginning to gather dust from the unpaved street, followed by Dutch Graves, William Hartwell, and what seemed like half the town, all drawn by curiosity to see where the donkey would lead them. Moses headed directly toward the outskirts of town, taking the road that led toward Jake's homestead. His pace was steady and purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going and why. The crowd followed in a long, straggling line, their voices creating a low buzz of speculation and excitement. "Where in hell is that animal taking us?" Judge Whitman muttered under his breath, lifting his robes to avoid catching them on the rough trail. His judicial dignity was clearly suffering from the unconventional nature of the situation. But instead of continuing to Jake's cabin, Moses turned off the main path and began climbing a rocky trail that led into the hills behind town. The terrain grew rougher with each step, and several of the older spectators began to fall behind, but Moses pressed on with unwavering determination. Jake watched Dutch Graves closely as they climbed. The foreman's usual confidence seemed to be eroding with each step, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like growing anxiety. His pale eyes darted constantly between Moses and the surrounding terrain, as if he were trying to calculate something, to understand where they were being led. They had been walking for nearly 30 minutes when Moses suddenly stopped at what appeared to be a natural depression in the hillside, hidden from casual view by a cluster of large boulders and scrub oak. The donkey began braying urgently again, pawing at the ground with his front hooves and circling a particular spot, as if trying to draw attention to something specific. Sheriff Bradley approached the area Moses was indicating and immediately stopped. Short, his weathered face registering complete amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of astonishment and dawning understanding. Partially concealed beneath a thin layer of dirt and dead leaves were the remnants of a campsite, the cold ashes of a fire that had been carefully extinguished, empty cans that had contained food, and most significantly a pile of cowhide with the Cross H brand still clearly visible. But it was what lay beside the cowhide that made everyone present catch their breath in unified shock. There, carefully hidden beneath a flat stone, were a pair of worn work boots and an old horseshoe, both bearing the distinctive marks that Dutch Graves had testified matched Jake's perfectly, the unusual wear pattern on the left boot heel, the specific chip in the horseshoe that left its unique impression. Dr. Whitfield was the first to recover from the shock, kneeling beside the boots and examining them with the methodical precision she brought to all her investigations. "These boots are the same size as Mr. Morrison's," she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "But they're not his boots. Look at the wear pattern. It's been artificially created, probably by dragging them over rough stone to create the appearance of natural wear." Sheriff Bradley picked up the horseshoe and studied it closely, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. Same thing here. This shoe's been deliberately damaged to match the description Graves gave. Someone's gone to considerable trouble to create false evidence. A stunned silence fell over the crowd as the implications of the discovery began to sink in like cold water through clothing. Someone had not only stolen Hartwell's cattle, but had gone to elaborate lengths to frame Jake Morrison for the crime. The false tracks at Willow Canyon, the manufactured evidence hidden in the hills, it all pointed to a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to put an innocent man's neck in a noose. Judge Whitman turned to Dutch Graves, his pale eyes now carrying the cold fury of a man who had been deceived in his own courtroom. "Mr. Graves, you testified under oath that you tracked the stolen cattle to Willow Canyon and found clear evidence of Mr. Morrison's guilt. How do you explain this?" Graves's face had gone pale beneath his customary tan, his confident demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. His pale eyes darted between the evidence, the hostile crowd, and the various escape routes available to him. For the first time since Jake had known him, the foreman seemed uncertain, calculating odds that were rapidly turning against him. This doesn't make sense," Graves stammered, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Someone must have planted this evidence to confuse the investigation, to make it look like Morrison was framed, or someone planted the evidence at Willow Canyon to frame an innocent man," Sarah Coleman said sharply, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "The question is, who would go to such lengths, and why?" William Hartwell had been studying the scene with the shrewd eyes of a successful businessman who was beginning to understand that he had been systematically deceived. His face was hardening with each passing moment, the realization of betrayal settling over him like a dark cloud. "Dutch," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone, "I think you and I need to have a conversation, a private conversation." But Graves wasn't listening to his employer. His calculating gaze had settled on Moses, who was still pawing at the ground near another spot, a few feet away from the first discovery. The donkey's behavior suggested there was more evidence to find, and Graves seemed to realize with growing horror that whatever secrets lay buried here might expose him completely. "I think we've seen enough," Graves said quickly, moving toward the trail with obvious urgency. "This doesn't change the fact that Morrison's tracks were found at the scene of the crime. This could be anyone's campsite." "Hold on there, Sheriff," Bradley commanded, his hand dropping to his gun with the smooth efficiency of a lawman who had dealt with dangerous criminals before. "Nobody's leaving until we've thoroughly searched this area. If there's more evidence here, we're going to find it." Moses had indeed found something else. His persistent pawing had uncovered a leather saddlebag, carefully buried and wrapped in oilcloth to protect its contents from moisture. When Bradley opened the package with careful hands, he found detailed maps of the valley showing cattle locations marked in pencil, notes about guard schedules written in a neat hand, and most damaging of all, a letter of credit from a cattle buyer in Denver, a buyer known throughout the territory for not asking too many questions about the origins of the livestock he purchased. The letter was addressed to Dutch Graves. "Well, Dutch," William Hartwell said, his voice carrying a cold fury that made several people step back from the confrontation. "It appears you've been running quite an operation under my nose, using your position as my foreman to scout out cattle for theft, then framing innocent men to cover your tracks when the heat got too close." Graves's composure finally cracked completely like a dam bursting under pressure. His pale eyes took on a wild, desperate look, and his hand moved toward the gun at his hip. The crowd tensed, sensing that the situation was about to turn violent, but Sheriff Bradley was ready for him, drawing his weapon with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd faced dangerous criminals many times before. "Don't make this worse than it already is, Dutch," Bradley warned, his voice steady and professional. "You're already looking at a hanging. Don't add resisting arrest and threatening an officer to your crimes." For a moment that stretched like an eternity. It seemed as though Graves might try to fight his way out of the situation. His eyes darted around the assembled crowd, measuring distances, calculating odds, looking for any avenue of escape. But the reality of his situation was inescapable. He was surrounded by armed men, on rough terrain that offered little chance of successful flight, and the evidence of his guilt was now overwhelming and undeniable. Slowly, with the careful movements of a man who knew he was beaten, Graves raised his hands above his head. His thin lips curved into that familiar, humorless smile one last time, but now it carried the bitter taste of defeat rather than confidence. "You know," he said conversationally, his voice carrying an eerie calm that was somehow more unsettling than his earlier panic, "it would have worked perfectly if it hadn't been for that damn donkey. Morrison would have swung from the gallows, I'd have sold the cattle and disappeared with a tidy profit, and nobody would have been the wiser." "Why, Jake?" Sarah Coleman demanded, her voice shaking with anger at the casual cruelty of Graves's scheme. "Why frame an innocent man? Why not just steal the cattle and run?" Graves shrugged with apparent indifference, as if they were discussing the weather rather than a conspiracy that had nearly cost an innocent man his life. He was perfect for the job, isolated, broke, no family to raise a fuss when he was gone. Sometimes you need a scapegoat when you're running a long-term operation, and Morrison was conveniently available. The casual cruelty of the statement sent a ripple of anger through the crowd. But it was Judge Whitman who spoke next, his voice carrying all the authority of his office and the weight of outraged justice. "Dutch Graves, I hereby place you under arrest for grand theft, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder through false testimony. Sheriff Bradley, please escort the prisoner back to town immediately. And someone remove those shackles from Mr. Morrison. It appears we've found our real criminal." As the shackles fell away from Jake's wrists with a metallic clink that seemed to echo through the morning air, Moses trotted over and pressed his head against his friend's legs, braying softly, with what could only be described as satisfaction. The donkey's dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if he understood exactly what he had accomplished and took quiet pride in saving his companion's life. Jake knelt beside Moses, wrapping his arms around the donkey's neck, and feeling the coarse hair and warm skin that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. For a moment he couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the realization of how close he had come to losing everything. The hangman's noose had been waiting for him in the town square, and without Moses's intervention, he would have been walking toward it within hours. "How did you know, old friend?" Jake whispered into Moses's ear, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you know where to find the truth, when everyone else was blinded by lies?" The return journey to Clearwater took place in an atmosphere of stunned amazement, with the crowd that had come to witness Jake Morrison's conviction instead processing the dramatic reversal of fortune that had just unfolded. Dutch Graves walked in shackles now, flanked by Sheriff Bradley and 2 deputies, while Jake followed behind as a free man for the first time in 3 days, with Moses trotting contentedly beside him. The implications of Graves's confession were sinking in gradually, creating ripples of unease throughout the community, like stones thrown into still water. If the foreman had been willing to frame Jake for cattle theft, what other crimes might he have committed during his 2 years in the valley? How many other solved cases might need to be re-examined in light of this revelation? William Hartwell walked in grim silence, his face reflecting the particular anger of a man who had discovered betrayal within his own organization. The rancher had built his empire on trust. Trust in his employees, trust in his judgment of character, trust in his ability to maintain control over his domain. Graves's deception represented not just a financial loss, but a fundamental breach of the order Hartwell had worked decades to establish. "How long has this been going on?" Hartwell asked Sheriff Bradley as they descended the rocky trail, his voice carrying the weight of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. "How many cattle has he stolen? How many other crimes has he committed while wearing my brand and drawing my pay? We'll have to investigate thoroughly." Bradley replied, his own voice reflecting the complexity of the situation they now faced. "But based on what we found up there, I'd say he's been planning this particular operation for months, maybe longer. A man doesn't create that kind of detailed evidence, doesn't establish contacts with buyers in Denver without considerable preparation." Dr. Whitfield, who had remained close to Jake during the descent, found herself studying Moses with renewed respect and curiosity. The donkey walked with a calm dignity that seemed to reflect his awareness of what he had accomplished, occasionally glancing up at Jake with those intelligent dark eyes. "I've read about animals displaying extraordinary intelligence in crisis situations," she told Jake quietly as they navigated a particularly rocky section of the trail. "But I've never witnessed anything quite like this." The way he knew exactly where to lead us, the persistence he showed in getting our attention, it suggests a level of understanding that goes far beyond normal animal behavior. Jake shook his head, still somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events and their implications. Moses has always been smart, always seemed to understand more than most animals, but this... He paused to stroke the donkey's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the animal that had saved his life. It's like he knew exactly what needed to be done and where to find the proof that would clear my name. Perhaps he observed more than we realized, Dr. Whitfield suggested, her medical mind already working through the possibilities. Animals often notice things humans miss: sounds, scents, movements that don't fit the normal patterns they're accustomed to. If Graves was operating near your property, planning his frame-up, Moses might have been aware of his activities without you realizing it. The possibility made disturbing sense to Jake. It meant that he had been living in proximity to danger, without realizing it, that his peaceful existence had been under threat for longer than he'd known. Graves had been studying him, learning his habits, planning his destruction with the same methodical precision he'd brought to stealing cattle. As they reached the outskirts of town, word of the dramatic developments had already spread through Clearwater like wildfire. People lined the streets, but their faces showed confusion and shame rather than the angry satisfaction they had displayed that morning. The community was grappling with the realization that they had nearly participated in the execution of an innocent man, that their rush to judgment had almost resulted in a terrible miscarriage of justice. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway of the general store, her hand pressed to her mouth in obvious distress. When she saw Jake, she stepped forward, hesitantly. "Jake, I'm so sorry. We should have known better. We should have trusted what we knew about your character instead of being swayed by convenient evidence." Her words opened a floodgate of similar apologies from other townspeople who had known Jake for years, but had allowed themselves to be convinced of his guilt by Dutch Graves's carefully constructed deception. The shame in their faces was evident, a community coming to terms with how easily they had been manipulated into abandoning one of their own. Judge Whitman had maintained his stern composure throughout the return journey, but Jake could see the anger simmering beneath his judicial exterior. The judge had been made a fool of in his own courtroom, deceived by perjured testimony and manufactured evidence. His reputation for swift, certain justice had nearly resulted in the hanging of an innocent man. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said as they reached the jail where Graves would now be held, "I owe you a formal apology on behalf of this court. You have suffered a grave injustice, and I bear responsibility for nearly allowing it to reach its ultimate conclusion." Jake nodded acknowledgement of the apology, though he wasn't sure words could fully address what he had experienced. The fear, the desperation, the certainty that he was going to die for crimes he hadn't committed, those were scars that would take time to heal, regardless of how sincere the community's remorse might be. Sheriff Bradley led Graves into the same cell that had held Jake, the irony of the situation lost on no one present. As the cell door clanged shut, Graves turned to face the crowd that had gathered outside the jail. His pale eyes held no remorse, only the calculating expression of a man already planning his next move. "You think this is over?" Graves said, his voice carrying through the barred window. But it's not. You got my confession about Morrison, but that's all you've got. Proving the rest of it, the other thefts, the other crimes, that's going to be considerably harder. William Hartwell stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun, his face set in the hard lines of a man who had made a decision. We'll see about that, Dutch. I'm offering $1,000 reward for information about your other activities, every rancher you've stolen from, every crime you've committed while working for me. It's all going to come to light. The promise of reward money would bring forward witnesses who might otherwise have remained silent, Jake realized. Graves had made enemies during his time in the valley, people who had suspected him of wrongdoing but hadn't been able to prove it. Now they would have both motivation and protection to come forward with their stories. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself standing in the main street of Clearwater, a free man but profoundly changed by his experience. The community that had been ready to hang him 3 hours ago was now looking at him with a mixture of shame, relief, and uncertain hope for forgiveness. Sarah Coleman approached him, her practical manner providing an anchor of normalcy in the swirling emotions of the moment. Jake, you can't stay in town tonight. Too many people feeling guilty, too many wanting to make amends all at once. Come home with me for a few days. Let things settle down. The offer was tempting, but Jake found himself looking toward the road that led to his homestead, to the simple cabin where Martha's memory waited for him. He needed time to process what had happened, to understand how his life had changed, and he needed to do it in the place where he felt closest to the woman who had been his anchor through every previous crisis. I appreciate the offer, Sarah, but I need to go home. Moses and I need to check on things, make sure everything's all right after these past few days. Dr. Whitfield approached before he could leave, her medical bag in her hand and concern evident in her intelligent eyes. Mr. Morrison, I'd like to examine you again in a few days. You've been under tremendous stress, and sometimes the effects don't show immediately. The body and mind both need time to recover from trauma of this magnitude. Jake nodded his agreement, understanding that his ordeal was far from over, even though the immediate danger had passed. The physical and emotional toll of facing execution would take time to heal, and he would need help processing the experience. As he prepared to leave town with Moses, Reverend Hayes approached with Martha's Bible in his hands. You left this in the jail cell, the minister said gently. I thought you might want it back. Jake accepted the Bible with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the familiar weight of the book that had provided comfort during his darkest hours. The red ribbon bookmark was still in place, marking Martha's favorite passage in Psalms, a reminder that some things endured even through the worst of times. The walk home with Moses was quiet, both man and donkey seeming to need the peace after. The drama of the day, the familiar sights of the homestead, the weathered cabin, the leaning barn, the small cemetery where Martha rested, looked exactly the same, yet everything felt different. Jake had left this place as a condemned man and returned as someone who had looked death in the face and been saved by the loyalty of a faithful friend. As evening approached, Jake sat on his porch with Moses beside him, watching the sun set over the valley that had nearly become his graveyard. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, indifferent to human drama, a reminder that life would continue regardless of individual triumphs or tragedies. But for now, in this moment, Jake Morrison was alive and free, and that was enough. 2 days after Moses' dramatic revelation, Dutch Graves sat in his jail cell and made a decision that would shock the entire valley. Perhaps it was the weight of the evidence against him, or perhaps it was the calculating realization that cooperation might buy him some consideration when it came time for sentencing. But Graves chose to make a full confession that revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise. Sheriff Bradley sat across from the prisoner with pen and paper, documenting every word as Graves laid out a web of theft and deception that had been operating under everyone's noses for nearly 2 years. The foreman spoke with the same methodical precision he had displayed on the witness stand, but now he was detailing his own crimes rather than fabricating evidence against an innocent man. "It started small," Graves began, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond the cell walls. "A few head here and there, cattle that wouldn't be missed immediately. I had contacts in Denver, buyers who didn't ask too many questions about paperwork or brands. The money was good, and the risk seemed manageable." The confession painted a picture of systematic theft that had grown bolder with each success. Graves had used his position as Hartwell's foreman to scout other ranchers' herds, learning their routines, identifying their most valuable cattle, and planning thefts with military precision. Hartwell's cattle were never the primary target, Graves continued, a thin smile playing at his lips. They were too well guarded, too closely watched. But I knew every ranch in the valley, knew which ones had weak security, which owners were too trusting or too lazy to keep proper track of their stock. Bradley's pen scratched across the paper as he documented names, dates, and details of thefts that had puzzled ranchers throughout the territory. The Walker Ranch had lost 15 head 6 months ago, attributed to wolves or rustlers passing through. The Peterson spread had seen 10 prime steers disappear, blamed on poor record-keeping by the elderly widow who ran it. A dozen smaller operations had suffered similar losses, none significant enough to warrant major investigation. The beauty of it was the trust, Graves explained with obvious pride in his criminal ingenuity. As Hartwell's foreman, I was the man other ranchers came to for advice about security, about protecting their herds. I helped them plan their defenses while planning how to defeat them. The confession revealed that Jake's frame-up had been planned for months, not as a response to any specific threat, but as preparation for a much larger theft. Graves had intended to steal 50 head of Cross-H cattle, worth nearly $3,000, and disappear from the territory permanently. Jake was to be the scapegoat who would satisfy the community's need for justice while allowing the real criminal to escape. Morrison was perfect, Graves said with the same casual cruelty he had displayed during his capture. Isolated, desperate for money, with no family to investigate too thoroughly if something happened to him. I spent weeks learning his routines, his habits, even the wear pattern on his boots. The fake evidence took time to prepare properly. Word of the confession spread through Clearwater and beyond, bringing a parade of visitors to the jail. Ranchers who had suffered unexplained losses came to hear details of their own cases, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger and vindication as long-standing mysteries were finally solved. William Hartwell arrived at the jail looking like a man who had aged years in a matter of days. His silver hair seemed to have lost some of its luster, and his usual commanding presence was tempered by the weight of betrayal. He stared at Graves through the cell bars with the cold fury of a man who had been systematically deceived by someone he had trusted. 2 years, Dutch, Hartwell said quietly. 2 years you sat at my table, drew my pay, made decisions about my ranch while planning to rob me blind. How much did you steal from me directly? Graves met his former employer's gaze without flinching. About 200 head over time, small numbers, taken gradually so you wouldn't notice the loss. Your books show normal mortality rates, predator kills, the kind of losses every rancher expects. The casual admission hit Hartwell like a physical blow. 200 head represented a significant fortune, money that could have expanded his operations or provided security for lean years. But more than the financial loss, it was the betrayal that stung. The realization that his judgment of character had been so fundamentally flawed. Judge Whitman visited the jail as well, his stern face reflecting the particular anger of a jurist who had been deceived in his own courtroom. The judge's reputation for swift, certain justice had been built over decades of careful consideration and fair judgment. Graves's perjured testimony had nearly destroyed that reputation and cost an innocent man his life. Your testimony under oath nearly resulted in the execution of an innocent man, Judge Whitman told Graves, his voice carrying the weight of absolute condemnation. That makes you guilty of not just theft, but attempted murder through false witness. There will be no mercy in your sentencing. The community's response to the full confession was complex and troubling. Relief that the real criminal had been caught was mixed with shame over their treatment of Jake Morrison and anger at being so thoroughly manipulated. Town meetings were held to discuss how such a situation could be prevented in the future, how a community could maintain its commitment to justice while avoiding the kind of rush to judgment that had nearly proven fatal. Dr. Whitfield found herself in the unusual position of analyzing not just individual medical conditions, but the psychological state of an entire community. Mass hysteria, she explained to a gathering at the church. When people are frightened or angry, they become susceptible to manipulation. Graves understood this and used it against us. Jake Morrison had become an uncomfortable symbol of the community's failure, a living reminder of how quickly trust could turn to suspicion, how easily truth could be buried under convenient lies. Some people couldn't meet his eyes when they passed on the street, their shame over their treatment of him creating a barrier that would take time to overcome. But there were also signs of the community's determination to make amends. A fund was quietly established to help with Jake's financial difficulties. Neighbors began appearing at his homestead to help with repairs and chores he had been unable to complete while in jail, and Reverend Hayes organized special services focused on themes of forgiveness and redemption. As the full scope of Graves's crimes became clear, Jake found himself struggling with complex emotions. Relief at his vindication was mixed with anger at the systematic planning that had gone into his frame-up, and gratitude for his salvation was tempered by the knowledge of how close he had come to death. Moses remained his constant companion, as if the donkey understood that his humans still needed the comfort and loyalty that had saved both their lives. William Hartwell's investigation into the full scope of Dutch Graves's crimes began at dawn the day after the confession. The rancher arrived at his own ranch house with a grim determination that his foreman had never seen, carrying ledgers, maps, and a cold fury that had burned away any trace of the trust that had once defined their relationship. The Cross H brand, which had stood for integrity and success throughout the territory, had been tainted by the betrayal of the man entrusted to protect it. Hartwell spread his record books across the dining room table that had once hosted Graves for countless meals, his silver hair catching the morning light as he bent over columns of figures that now told a very different story than he had originally understood. Every entry needed to be re-examined, every loss reconsidered in light of what he now knew about his foreman's systematic theft. 200 head over 2 years, he muttered to himself, his pen scratching corrections and annotations across pages of carefully maintained records. Nearly 10% of my total herd, taken gradually so I wouldn't notice the pattern, the Sioux. Mathematical precision of the theft was almost as infuriating as the betrayal itself. Graves had stolen with the methodical patience of a man who understood that greed had destroyed many criminals, that steady, modest theft was far more profitable than dramatic raids that attracted attention. He had turned Hartwell's own careful record-keeping against him, using the rancher's trust in his honesty to cover systematic deception. By afternoon, other ranchers began arriving at the Cross H, drawn by word that Hartwell was conducting a comprehensive investigation into Graves's activities. They came with their own ledgers and their own stories of mysterious losses that had never been satisfactorily explained. The widow Peterson arrived in her buckboard, her lined face reflecting years of puzzlement over the disappearance of cattle she had been blamed for miscounting. 10 prime steers vanished last spring, she told Hartwell, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who had been made to doubt her own competence. Dutch himself helped me search for them, spent 2 whole days combing the range, said they probably wandered off during that bad storm we had, got lost in the canyons where the wolves could get them. The pattern was consistent across every rancher's story. Graves had not only stolen their cattle, but had actively participated in the searches for the missing animals, offering comfort and explanations that deflected suspicion while reinforcing his reputation as a trustworthy member of the community. His position as Hartwell's foreman had given him credibility that he had weaponized against his victims. Jake Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of being both victim and key witness as the investigation expanded. His testimony would be crucial in ensuring that Graves faced justice for the full scope of his crimes, not just the attempted frame-up. Sheriff Bradley had asked him to review the confession and identify any additional details that might help build the strongest possible case. Sitting in Bradley's office with Moses lying quietly at his feet, Jake read through page after page of Graves's methodical documentation of theft and deception. Each entry represented someone's loss, someone's trust betrayed, someone's livelihood stolen by a man who had presented himself as protector of their interests. He mentions observing your routine for weeks before planting the evidence, Bradley noted, pointing to a specific passage in the confession. Says he learned your habits well enough to predict where you'd be at any given time. That's how he knew when it would be safe to hide the fake evidence on your property. The realization that he had been under surveillance for months was deeply unsettling to Jake. His peaceful existence had been a facade, his privacy violated by a man planning his destruction with the same care most people devoted to honest work. Every morning routine, every evening chore, every quiet moment with Moses had been watched and catalogued for use against him. As the week progressed, the community's efforts to make amends to Jake became more organized and substantial. A delegation led by Reverend Hayes appeared at his homestead with materials and volunteer labor to complete the repairs his cabin had needed for months. The bank quietly restructured his loan, removing the immediate threat of foreclosure that had been hanging over his head like a sword. But the most meaningful gesture came from an unexpected source. William Hartwell arrived at Jake's cabin one evening, his usually commanding presence subdued by the weight of what his employee had done. The silver-haired rancher stood hat in hand before the man who had nearly died because of his poor judgment in hiring Dutch Graves. "Morrison," Hartwell began, his voice carrying a humility that few people had ever heard from him. "I owe you more than an apology. My failure to see what Graves really was nearly cost you your life. I hired him, I trusted him, I gave him the authority he used to destroy other people's lives." Jake studied the rancher's face, seeing genuine remorse in the eyes of a man who had built an empire on his ability to judge character. "You couldn't have known, Mr. Hartwell. Graves fooled everyone, not just you. The man was a skilled liar who knew how to present himself as trustworthy." "That's generous of you to say, but it doesn't change my responsibility," Hartwell replied. "I want to offer you a position, Morrison, foreman of the Cross H, with a salary that will solve your financial problems and give you the security you deserve. It's the least I can do." The offer was substantial and tempting, representing financial security beyond anything Jake had previously imagined. But as he looked around his modest homestead, at the simple cabin where he had been happy with Martha, at Moses grazing peacefully in the evening light, he realized that some things mattered more than money. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hartwell. I truly do. But this place is my home. Martha's buried here, and Moses and I have our life here. If you want to help, maybe you could throw some work my way from time to time, but I need to stay where I belong." Hartwell nodded with understanding, recognizing a man who valued roots over riches. "The offer stands whenever you change your mind. And there'll be plenty of work available. Beef sales, fence repairs, whatever you need to keep going." As the rancher prepared to leave, he paused at the gate and looked back at Jake. "That donkey of yours saved more than just your life. He saved this whole community from participating in a terrible injustice. We owe him as much as we owe you." That evening, as Jake sat on his porch with Moses beside him, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. A week ago, he had been Facing death, convinced that truth had been buried under convenient lies. Now justice was being served, his community was healing, and his faithful companion had become a local legend. The gallows still stood in the town square, but they would serve their purpose correctly this time, claiming the life of a guilty man rather than an innocent one. 6 months had passed since Dutch Graves met his end at the gallows in Clearwaters, town square, and the valley had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and fundamentally changed. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and Jake Morrison found himself standing beside Martha's grave marker beneath the old oak tree, its branches now bare against the grey October sky. The simple wooden cross bore her name and the dates that bracketed her too brief life, but it represented so much more than the physical resting place of his beloved wife. It had become a symbol of continuity, of love that transcended death, of the enduring connections that gave meaning to a man's existence even in the darkest times. "I wanted to tell you what's been happening, Martha," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Moses stood nearby, as he always did during these visits, the donkey's presence a comforting reminder that loyalty came in many forms. "I think you'd be pleased with how things have worked out." The homestead around them showed signs of renewal and care that had been impossible during the lean years following Martha's death. The cabin bore a fresh coat of whitewash that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the barn stood straight and strong, its roof repaired and its doors hanging properly on new hinges. The corral had been rebuilt with sturdy rails, and the small garden plot where Martha had grown her vegetables showed the neat furrows of autumn preparation. These improvements had come not from Jake's own resources, which remained modest, but from the community's determination to make amends for their treatment of him during those dark days in September. The guilt over their rush to judgment had motivated a sustained effort to repair not just their relationship with Jake, but the damage their doubt had done to his livelihood. William Hartwell had been true to his word about providing work opportunities. The Cross H Ranch had contracted with Jake for fence repairs, cattle drives, and seasonal labor that provided steady income without requiring him to leave his beloved homestead. The work was honest and fairly paid, and it allowed Jake to maintain his independence while rebuilding his financial security. The bank had restructured his loan with terms so favorable that Jake sometimes wondered if they were giving him charity disguised as business. But when he had questioned the arrangement, the banker had simply said that the community had an investment in seeing him succeed, that his survival was somehow important to everyone's sense of justice and redemption. Other gestures of reconciliation had been more personal and perhaps more meaningful. Mrs. Henderson had taken to having Moses's favorite apples available whenever Jake came to town, always refusing payment with the gentle insistence that it was the least she could do. Old Pete Murphy had declared that Jake's first drink was always free at his saloon, a standing invitation that Jake rarely accepted but appreciated nonetheless. Dr. Whitfield had become a regular visitor to the homestead, officially checking on Jake's recovery from his ordeal, but actually providing the kind of friendship that had been rare in his life since Martha's passing. Her medical knowledge had been invaluable in understanding the lasting effects of trauma, but her practical wisdom and dry humor had been equally important in helping him process the experience. "The whole thing changed us," she had told him during one of her visits. "Made us realize how quickly trust can turn to suspicion, how easily truth can be buried under convenient lies. But it also showed us what real loyalty looks like." She had nodded toward Moses, who had been grazing peacefully nearby. "That animal of yours became a symbol of something the community needed to believe in." Moses had indeed become something of a local legend. Children from town would sometimes walk out to the homestead just to see the donkey who had saved an innocent man's life, and their parents would tell and retell the story of how loyalty and intelligence had triumphed over deception and hatred. The donkey seemed to understand his elevated status, carrying himself with a dignity that bordered on the regal, while remaining the same faithful companion he had always been to Jake. The changes in Jake himself were more subtle, but perhaps more profound. The experience of facing death and being saved by truth had given him a perspective on life that was both deeper and more immediate. Each morning brought a renewed appreciation for simple freedoms, the ability to walk his land, to tend his cattle, to sit on his porch in the evening and watch the sun set over mountains that would outlast all human drama. His relationship with the community had evolved into something more complex than it had been before. The easy, unthinking trust of earlier years was gone, replaced by a more mature understanding of human nature's capacity for both betrayal and redemption. But there was also a deeper appreciation for the bonds that held people together, for the efforts required to maintain a society based on mutual respect and shared values. Reverend Hayes had become a regular visitor as well, the two men finding common ground in their understanding of forgiveness as both a practical necessity and a spiritual discipline. Anger is a luxury none of us can afford for very long, the minister had observed during one of their conversations. It consumes the person who holds it more than the person it's directed toward. As winter approached, Jake found himself looking forward to the challenges of the cold months with a confidence that had been missing for years. His cattle were healthy and well-fed, his buildings were sound, and his finances were stable for the first time since Martha's illness. More importantly, he had rediscovered his place in a community that, despite its flaws and failures, had ultimately chosen truth over convenience and justice over expedience. Standing beside Martha's grave as the afternoon light faded toward evening, Jake felt her presence in a way that seemed more real than memory. She had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people, even when that goodness was buried under fear or prejudice or misunderstanding. The community's response to his ordeal had vindicated that faith, showing that redemption was possible even after terrible mistakes. "I think you'd be proud of us all," he told the simple wooden cross. "We learned some hard lessons, but we learned them. And Moses here, well, you always said that animal was special. Turns out you were more right than any of us knew." As if understanding that he was being discussed, Moses lifted his head and brayed softly, the sound carrying across the peaceful valley where autumn was settling into the rhythm of another turning year. Man and donkey walked back toward the cabin together, their friendship strengthened by shared trials and their future brightened by the knowledge that truth, loyalty, and justice could still triumph in a world that sometimes seemed to have forgotten their value. The mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky, silent witnesses to human drama that played out in cycles of conflict and resolution, betrayal and forgiveness, despair and hope. In this particular cycle, an innocent man had been saved by the loyalty of a faithful friend, and a community had rediscovered the values that made civilization possible. It was enough, Jake thought as he lit his evening lamp, to justify faith in tomorrow.